Okay, welcome to AROYA Office Hours Live. This is a chance for all of us, whether you're AROYA customers, AROYA curious, or just into growing and existing in this exciting industry, to share stories and get all your burning cultivation questions answered. Each week, we'll spend an hour sharing findings, talking you through some interesting features, having a lively conversation, and learning more about what you're doing. And we want you to jump in and ask questions and participate as well. That's what the office hours are about. So today's discussion, we're going to be talking about drybacks, what works, what doesn't, and getting a handle on them and what they can do for your ROI. And as we're going along here, if you have questions, please do submit them in the chat and we'll get to them. As we dive into the subject of drybacks, we're just going to talk a little bit about what they are, why they're important, and Jason has some slides and information that he's going to share on that as well. But the word dryback, as it's used and as we'll use it today, is just about it refers to a period of time when your plants aren't being watered, when they're using water, and when the water content you'll see drop. And it depends on what substrate you're using, but in rockwool, this might be, say, from 65% or high 60s water content in rockwool all the way down to, say, 35%. That would be a big dryback of more than 30%. And what the dryback does, and the reason why they are so important, is because of what they accomplish with poor water EC. Because as that plant is being dried back, and as the plant uses water from the substrate, and as it's not being replenished from the irrigation system, what you're getting is a gradual increase in the poor water EC, which is which produces a certain amount of water stress for the crop. And depending on the phase of growth that the crop is in, we would want to use longer drybacks, achieving a higher poor water EC in generative phase, for example, or much shorter drybacks and protecting the plant from any stress during, say, a vegetative phase. So that's an overview of drybacks and what they are. When we talk about percent dryback, we're talking about, as I said before, if you go from, say, a 55% water content to a 35% water content, we call that a 20% dryback that you achieve during that time. And typically, and we'll go through some of the questions, some specific questions on these, but typically what we're talking about when we're measuring the time of a dryback is we're timing it from that last point that you watered the plant all the way up until the first watering of the next day. That's the dryback duration. So we'll talk about dryback size and also dryback duration. The size we refer to in percentage terms, and the duration we're going to talk about at time. So did I miss anything on that, Jason?
I don't think so. It sounded great.
Okay. I wasn't fishing, but thank you. Some of the subjects that we wanted to talk about today, we'll start with the first one of what is the benefit and the purpose of dryback in cultivation as a whole.
So it's exercising the plant. Obviously, if we keep that plant at a field capacity or saturation point too long, the roots are going to get lazy on us. And so obviously, as the transpiration rate is sucking water out of that substrate, we're going to go on a circadian regular, so circadian being 24-hour cycle, and we're going to get that thing some irrigation every day, encourage some plant growth response when we do irrigate. And depending on the type of steering or the type of plant morphology that we're pushing for, we can use that irrigation strategy to change the physiology. So when we talk about physiology, that's the plant's internal response to what we're doing to it. When we talk about morphology, that's the desired shape, size, the outcome of how that plant is growing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And how do drybacks affect those things?
So when we encourage a wider irrigation window, and so when I say irrigation window, I'm not talking about the total time of irrigation or the total amount of irrigation. I'm talking about from first irrigation to last irrigation. It's just the inverse of dryback time. So if we've got 24 hours and we run a 2-hour irrigation window, then we'd have 22 hours of dryback.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk about either of them. I usually talk about irrigation window because that's what we are changing. That's what we're doing to the plant. And the dryback is just going to be the time left over there. So typically I'll talk about modifying that irrigation window. When we've got a wider irrigation window, it's going to encourage that plant to grow stalks, stems, leaves, any of that more vegetative type of material. That plant's going to usually stretch out. It's going to be the infrastructure for that plant to continue its growth. Now, when we encourage a little bit more generative steering, we'll shorten up that irrigation window. And I think one of our questions was talking about some of those timelines. We can jump into that right now.
Yeah, let's do it. That's great. And I'll just actually, so I can pull up some old data from the plants that I was growing at my house, which might be useful here. Let me see. But actually, why don't you dive into that one while I'm pulling up some actual dryback data to show people?
So absolutely. So when I was talking about a wider irrigation window, maybe when we're doing some distinctly vegetative growth, some that vegetative steering, we'll shoot for maybe 6 to 10 hour irrigation window. This is going to really be dependent on a number of things. We're talking about substrate size, drip rate, what type of strain that you're growing. So some strains are going to be naturally leaning on one side or the other of the spectrum, in which case you really want to have a balanced growth system. That's going to get you the best results. So jumping back around, vegetative irrigation, typically an irrigation window from 6 to 10 hours. When we're pushing for a more generative irrigation, so that generative is encouraging reproductive growth. That's getting our bud sites. That's getting nice node stacking in there and really encouraging that plant to produce flower. And those irrigation windows are going to be mostly in the range of maybe 1 to 3 hours for an irrigation window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something I didn't really understand that well before I started to try to achieve dryback with my plants. Is that basically what you're doing to achieve this dryback is you're either reducing the like if you wanted to achieve a larger dryback, you would either reduce the number of waterings or reduce the frequency or the shot size of those waterings. And then especially during the generative phase, you want to get them into a small window, a relatively tight, say 2 hour, 2.5 hours, get all your waterings done so that you can have a dryback over the rest of that time. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, when we talk about what generative is doing, and we can jump into some slides talking about P1 and P2 type irrigations as well. But when we're talking about generative, that's usually P1 irrigations, and that's getting to saturation reasonably quickly. Mm-hmm. I like to see, getting to saturation within, an hour of that first irrigation if possible.
Yep.
And we always recommend, if possible, to do a number of irrigations as well. So not necessarily one large shot to get there. You can get run through, you get runoff without necessarily letting the capillary effect of the substrate catch up with the rate of irrigation. So, a good P1, maybe you do 3, 4, 5 irrigations in a 1 hour irrigation window.
Yep.
Try to get up to that saturation point, or that field capacity would be the best scientific name for where we're hitting a point where the water's not going to hold anymore. It's going to be turning into runoff.
Yeah.
At that point, if we continue to.
Yeah, that point you just mentioned about multiple waterings, that's really critical, and it is something that you're not going to achieve the giving the plant the water and nutrients that it needs in a single shot, unless you're using maybe a different type of medium that isn't rockwool. But so it is important to look at your irrigation shot size and frequency as the dial that you're turning to be able to achieve what you want to in dryback. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see if I can get. Yeah. Okay. This is again, when we use examples from my tent grow, they are the data quality are not the highest. So is that on 2? Yeah, there we go. And on. Okay. Nice. So this is an example of a line. This is how my plants were watered in this was in a vegetative phase of growth. And you can see that we started out here at 32% water content. We got all the way up to, 38%. This was not super awesome. But you can see multiple waterings throughout the day from 10 a.m. all the way until the evening, say like looks like 5 o'clock. Then I stopped. And one thing to note in AROYA, and this is a really basic function, if you want to save the dryback that you were able to achieve in any given day, you click on this button right here and you click dryback. And if I was going to measure my dryback, I'd say, well, my last irrigation was right here. And this was when I started irrigating the next day, and that's my dryback. So we have a calculated dryback of 5.3%. Again, not super awesome, but I can go ahead and log that dryback, and it's saved in the journal. So Jason, do you want to pull up those slides on the P1, P2, P3, and share those? I can jump out of this.
Absolutely. I also did want to share. While you were doing that logging of dryback, you're all right.
Okay, right.
It saves as an annotation down there in the bottom, and we can also do a manual reading. So that dryback number is a manual reading, and if you do dryback calculations on a daily basis, or maybe every 2 or 3 days, you can chart that using your manual values.
Just click okay, I see. So
and it's going to automatically be a manual value based on calculation.
Oh, okay, I see. So you could just put it in by clicking here and also just manually entering it?
I believe that you might be able to. I'm not sure why you do that since there's
this
a tool.
Is real time dryback. Yeah. So you could note your dryback here, even though this is not correct. 10%. I'm in my zone here. Date and time, comments, record when reading. So yeah, you can do it manually if you want to. Actually, we did have a question on that. Can drybacks be calculated without a sensor?
Sure. It's going to be much more labor intensive. And I'm also going to talk about when you do log a dryback, you're only looking at one zone here, but when you log a dryback in AROYA, it's going to do it by those zone averages. So if you've got 8 zones in a room, it's going to do 8 manual readings of those drybacks. You kind of see a nice clean representation of that. Calculating drybacks without a sensor. I guess it depends what a sensor is. If a scale is not a sensor, or if a handheld reading is not a sensor, then you might be able to. Obviously, you'd need to go in and weigh the plants at last irrigation, and then go weigh it initial irrigation, and do some water content calculations based on the dry media weight and the weight of the water that was dispersed from transpiration and evaporation during that time frame. But when we think about that on scale, effectively, I guess the answer would be no.
Well, yes, I agree that if we're talking about no sensor, but that would have been my only suggestion. If you don't have a sensor, you could get a kitchen scale out and actually weigh the individual plants and understand how much they're drying back. The other thing about this graph is you can see that the rate at which the plant is using water is a lot higher when the lights are on, obviously, than when the lights are off. So these are two different relatively constant rates of water use throughout the plant growth process and the irrigation and the area where we're not doing irrigation. So, and you can see that rate at which the plant is using water returns to that higher level once the lights come back on the next day.
There's a couple contributing factors, and I already mentioned evaporation and transpiration. Those are really the two places that your water content is going. Obviously, ignoring runoff, because we're not going to necessarily see runoff in the water content on the sensors. You're going to have evaporation and transpiration during the daytime. The transpiration is going to be much higher when we've got light hitting those plants with a bunch of photosynthesis being active, and your evaporation is probably going to be slightly higher as well, maybe just due to some radiation from those lights. Obviously, that inflection point when the lights turn off, we can see a change in slope, which is actually a very good thing because that's indicating that our plants are transpiring significantly. So bigger change in that slope at that inflection point is going to really tell us that that plant is pulling hard.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have evaporation overnight. And that's why we do see some amount of dryback overnight. And your plants probably are going to do some transpiration when the lights are on as well. So.
Sure. Well, and another interesting thing that really was clear when I started to grow the plants was that the plant's capability of pulling water out of the substrate is very small when the plants are really small. When your plants are a foot tall or a foot and a half tall, they really don't have a root structure. They don't have their leaves and things aren't their leaves aren't well developed, and you're really not transpiring that much. It's not doing that much work. And even if you want to achieve a big dryback to stress the plant, it's probably not possible because the root structure isn't there to pull all that water out of the substrate and actually use it.
That's exactly right. And that falls into another question that we had, and that was talking about ideal drybacks during different stages of the growth cycle. And this is one of the reasons that we absolutely encourage and love using recipes, using that those different phases in your harvest group, because we want to know what are we trying to achieve during that time frame. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we know when those plants are really small, maybe we just transplanted, we're not going to necessarily see the types of drybacks that we will later. We're going to be shooting for just trying to get that root zone going and get those roots into the new media so that it can tap into the entire volume of that substrate.
Okay. And that's the root in phase. That's right before, that's when you're flipping the plants. Let's say that you're putting a cocoa bag on a cocoa bag, or you're putting a 4x4 block onto a slab of rockwool. That's getting the root development that you want, and that's a period of what, 4 or 5 days? Is that typical for root in, or?
Yeah, probably 3 to 5 days.
Okay. So there's the root in period, and then right after that, the plants are still really small. My guess would be that what we're really looking for is you mentioned the word recipe. We're looking for a time frame of a couple of hours, get all the waterings in. We're really targeting the dryback duration more than we are the size, because we're not going to achieve that much with really small plants right at the beginning of flower. Is that right?
That is exactly right. And after rooting in, you might go a few days to let that slab get down to a lower water content, so you can build a regular irrigation schedule for it the next coming days. I don't like to get into the specifics of exactly how long you might want to run that initial generative stacking, because it is very, very strain dependent.
Right.
You could talk about anywhere from 1 week to 4 or 5 weeks, depending on what type of genetics you're working with.
Okay.
And it's a critical and a little bit of a challenging time, because obviously it is labor intensive to keep an eye on daily drybacks and modify irrigation parameters based on what you saw yesterday. And so a lot of times, you'll start to see those drybacks get gradually more and more every day that you're hitting that. And at some point, you may need to up your irrigation schedule to keep up with the new growth, that root area that's pulling water. And then obviously, when we look at transpiration, that's talking about surface area of the leaves. So transpiration happens from those stomates being open, having water vapor leave the plant. So the more surface area we have, the more pores, the more stomates that are pulling water from the substrate.
Yep. Did you want to show that slide on P1, P2, P3 to just because we do talk about that sometimes, and just to give a visual of what we're talking about there.
Sure. Should I just share it in this Google Meet?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go right here. And we can just kind of run through these slides so that it's got context to what we're talking about as well. Here's a little bit of that, an example. And I do stress, example when I talk about this, because it's going to be dependent on genetics, depending on the goals of the facility, etc. So, just thinking about, okay, this is really flipping that stuff around a little bit to get the best growth out of the plant. This slide is showing an example of some water content, and the left side over here, we're talking about a P1 type irrigation. And these irrigations can be closer together in time spacing, or they can be a little bit larger size shots. And the goal there is to be getting to that field capacity fairly quickly. So we are looking at more vegetative growth in this slide. And we can see we've got P1s. We're getting up to that saturation point right here. Could be anywhere from 45 for Coco. Cocos are a little bit, they're dependent on the pith size, how much that Coco is chunked up, how loose it is, etc. And then up until probably about 65 or 70%, maybe a little bit more for rockwool. That's the fairly consistent field capacity we like to see out of those sensors. So yeah, that P1, those shots are obviously working to get to saturation. And then the P2 shots are trying to maintain saturation or field capacity for the duration of the irrigation window. And I really don't talk much about P3 irrigations because there's no irrigation there. P3 is just your dryback. It's not necessarily something you're doing to the plant. Your P3 is going to be a side effect of how well you achieved your desired P1 and P2 irrigation.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And this slide's just showing a little bit of some of the recommended timeframes before irrigation and after your last irrigation. I think we might have had one question about this. Maybe not. Start and finish. When do you start and finish dryback? Okay, so typically we like to see irrigations in between. This says 0 and 1 hours. We could say 0 and 2 hours after lights off to be a little bit more realistic of what facilities can achieve realistically. And then same kind of thing, after irrigation, you don't want to irrigate all the way up to lights off. That can lead to some extra humidity in the room, a little bit of root stagnation, possible pythium or other types of diseases in the plant. So typically you'll want to stop irrigating even if you've got a wide vegetative irrigation window, 0 to 2, 0 to 3, 0 to 4, depending on how wide your irrigation window is.
Mm-hmm.
This is just showing, pointing out, okay, each of these is oftentimes an irrigation. Depending on how many shots you are giving, sometimes you'll not necessarily see a defined peak from that sensor data. And that has to do with a couple things. One could just be the capillary effect of the substrate buffering each of those events. This is just showing, okay, here's dryback over here. Dryback calculation is saturation minus the starting point. So here's your dryback duration. In this case, it's 15 hours. And we can see that vertical difference is going to be the dryback percentage, and the horizontal is going to be that dryback duration that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
This next slide is showing generative steering irrigation. In this case, we can see we've pretty much ignored any P2 type of irrigations. We're doing some P1 irrigations to get up to that field capacity and letting that dryback window be much, much wider. Anything I missed?
Well, I think, one interesting thing in looking at this slide is that, if we were to plot the EC on top of this, we would see pretty much in most cases that the EC is going to increase for that entire duration of the dryback. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I might have some data here that reflects what we're seeing there as well. Let's jump in just to zoom in here.
Jason, while you gather that data, I just want to remind everybody on the call today, we're so happy that you're here, and we want to answer all of your questions. So our topic is drybacks today. Please feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat, and we would love to address them during this presentation. Back to you, Jason.
Thanks. This is some real life data. This is one of our development partners down the road here in Pullman, Washington. They're doing a great job and have allowed us to use their data for examples. And also, we collaborate with them testing new equipment at their facilities. So we really appreciate that opportunity to work with them. In this case, we're looking at a fairly moderate type of irrigation strategy. This is fairly well balanced. And I can also zoom in here to show what Scott was talking about, specifically with rise in EC when we see that water content drop. So zooming in here, we can see, all right, we're hitting some field capacity fairly quickly. That would be your P1 event right there. And then a good number of P2s right here. A little bit of dryback, lights off. We can see that change in water content loss of that substrate. And we can also see that EC rising up. So obviously that irrigation, when it happens, it's going to push the EC down in the block. It's going to basically refresh the nutrients in there. A lot of times that's going to drop closer to your irrigation feed concentration. So sometimes we do typically see that that nominal number down here, couple points, maybe 1, 2, 3 points higher than your actual feed of the EC or the feed of the nutrients. It's just going to depend on your media, your nutrient type, how you've been steering those plants up to that point as well. But so we'll see that distinctive drop. That substrate is getting refreshed with new balanced nutrients closer to our feed EC. And after as irrigation stop, we see that EC rise fairly quickly while transpiration is pulling water from the substrate reasonably fast. And then obviously overnight it tapers off, but still rises while that water content drops.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason why the EC goes up is because the plant is pulling water and some nutrients, but not as much nutrients, and the salts become more concentrated in the substrate. Is that right?
Correct.
So that's the scientific reason why this works. And I should say, as we're talking about dryback, the reason, people talk about it in the industry a lot, dryback. And the reason we do drybacks isn't so that we can remove the water. It's so that we can achieve a particular pour water EC that we're going for, that sends the signal to the plant, especially generatively, which is, okay, there's some stress now. I need to focus on reproduction, which is partitioning its energy toward bud sites or flower. And when we send those signals, if we do it in the right way, we can get higher yields. Is that the right way to explain it? Like, what we're trying to achieve is the stress. The dryback is how we do it, but what the plant's feeling is this pour water EC. Is that right?
Yeah, for the most part, that is right. And maybe I'll deep dive and hopefully not get too scientific with this real quick.
Please,
but
yeah.
So when we look at, and I talked about matrix potential a little bit last week, and I think we're going to be posting some great videos that your dad did about matrix potential in different types of hydroponic substrates. But so matrix potential being how much does that root zone, how much pressure or vacuum would be, it's a negative pressure. So how much vacuum do the roots have to apply to the substrate in order to pull water from that substrate?
Yep.
When we look at rockwool, for example, it's got a pretty, what we would call a high matrix potential. So you may only be seeing, I don't know, -20 to -100 kPa.
Yeah.
And that means that these plants, even when we do get pretty low in water content in rockwool, they're not necessarily having to pull extremely hard. They're not,
Right.
They may not be feeling an irrigation deficit.
Yep.
That is applied in traditional agriculture or horticulture techniques.
Yeah. Like grapes, for example, right?
Correct.
Like if we want to stress grapes, and people do this all over the world, it's basically reducing irrigation so that the matrix potential of the soil stresses those grapes. In cannabis, we're not doing that because there's plenty of water there, but we're stressing them with the salts, with the nutrients. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And so what we talk about is osmotic potential, osmotic effect. It happens in tons of biological applications. It's happening in you right now. It happens in me. I just drank some water and my cells are absorbing it. And when we look at a plant, that osmotic potential is going to be the differential in salt concentration within the cell versus the salt concentration within the substrate.
Mm-hmm.
And a larger osmotic differential is going to increase the pressure. So the cells are going to try and swell quicker based on the water intake. Obviously, when we let the EC rise, we're decreasing that osmotic potential and therefore trying to encourage the right type of morphology based on that physiological response on potential.
Yeah, and I think of it as like if you have a let's say the water as it comes into the block. So the drippers put the water into the block that the plant is growing in, and there has to be a osmotic differential between that block and the roots. And then there has to be an osmotic differential between the roots and the stem. And then there has to be a differential between the stem and the leaves. And then there has to be a differential between the atmosphere and the stomates, right? And the water has to make its way all the way through that process. And like if we talk about VPD, for example, that's, there has to be the right differential for the plants to transpire. There has to be some type of energy moving water and by default nutrients through that process as well. So it's just kind of a cycle. And drybacks are part of that. So we reduce the water and concentrate the nutrients, but the stress that the plant feels is through the concentration of the nutrients. So let's get to one of these questions. If you're saying, well, I've never done this before, what's a way to start using drybacks to help increase my yields? Where is a place to start?
A good place to start is running a control harvest group. Mm-hmm. So having some reference of your data before you make changes is the absolute best way to begin crop steering. And you might say, well, you're not crop steering, but you have to have a great understanding of what we are doing to those plants. How did this harvest group run without necessarily making any changes? And that's going to give you a wonderful baseline. So when you do start tweaking, when you do start to crop steer, you can make moderate, some mild adjustments to get to that. And the best way, and then the reason that a control is a great spot too, because I run into a lot of clients that maybe they have traditionally done hand watering, where they've got one large irrigation in the morning for those plants. Then we've also run into lots of clients that may just do a vegetative drip irrigation through the entire harvest group.
Right.
And so the way that you can start is building up a good recipe. And I did want to mention, so we've got a cultivation quick start guide available for any of the subscribers of the ROI system. It's down in our resource center. Bottom left, there's a question mark. And it's going to cover a lot of the topics that we're talking about here today.
Let me just pull that up real quick. So it's on here. It's is it in this resources?
It is.
Okay, so go here. Cultivation quick start, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we go on here. And yeah, there we go. Okay, so talking about the phases of growth, different definitions of things. Here's the plants. It is going to talk about the steering, crop steering, water and irrigation, the different substrates. So yeah, I agree. I use this. I've read through this a number of times, but it's funny because when I started out, trying to grow plants in this small tent, I had really basic problems like how to get them to actually be watered, like making the timer work, and lots of simple problems that are very frustrating nonetheless. And so I keep on having to go back and read this again, because once I figured out some things, then other pieces of this document start to make more sense. Here's the document that you're referring to.
Yeah, so this is a great place to start, and I think it does start from the beginning. I'm glad that you talked about getting other variables in line. So obviously having a good operating facility is going to be the best place to begin crop steering. And that's also why we always love to have some control data, is because it can highlight maybe some areas that could be improved before crop steering is employed. It's like if I'm driving down with some really loose ball joints, I might have a hard time steering down the highway because that rack and pinion or my ball joints are loose. It's going to be wobbling around. So if I get those tightened up, I'm going to have a lot better success when I do start to be serious about crop steering.
Yep.
And the environment is, I think, a little bit overlooked sometimes when we do get so excited about having red zone data and shooting for crop steering. Making sure that light intensity is going to help us produce the transpiration rates we need for the appropriate drybacks to steer. It's absolutely critical. Having your temperature and humidity balanced to get the VPD that allows for the most stomatal conductance as possible, that's going to get those transpiration rates where you need.
Yep. And that's in the generative phase. And I mean, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason I keep on talking about like you flip the plants into flower in this early generative phase is I've often heard it referred to as this critical time. You really need to make sure that you're doing things properly, and you set yourself up for success by nailing the generative steering in those, you said it could be anywhere from 1 to 5 weeks depending on the strain. But during that phase, what and implementing drybacks in that phase, you say something like the VPD is also important. So what VPD ranges are we looking for in that generative phase typically?
Usually we'll be shooting for about 1.2.
Mm-hmm.
You might, when you start the harvest group, be at around 1.0, during that rut-in session, and climb it up to say 1.2 for your first generative, that stacking session.
Sure. So I do totally agree with you about getting that control, getting that harvest group where you use it as a control. Like, hey, and let's say it's just a client who's always been steering vegetatively. They might not even call it that, but they're just doing lots of waterings throughout the day, keeping the plants super happy all the time. And there are even some strains, I think, was it Mac 1 you said likes to be steered vegetatively? Like it's just kind of a weird strain that way?
Great example. Yeah, it's a stubby, chunky plant anyways. It's not necessarily prone to a lot of the stretching. It's going to get the infrastructure it needs to yield well without doing too much generative steering.
Yeah. Now, so an example like that, you might have a client who's growing Mac 1, running it vegetatively the whole time, and then just introduces a little bit of say generative cues in that early flower phase and might see an improvement, but maybe not as much as somebody who would be like, I don't know, an OG Kush or something, a different type of.
Blue Dream is probably the other end of the spectrum that I like to use.
So Blue Dream likes it. It likes that generative cues.
It's a tall, stretchy sativa type of plant. Absolutely.
Okay. So that's one way to get started is put that baseline down and then look and then make a change to one thing. Like say, okay, well, during these first 3 weeks of flower, we're going to get all our waterings done within 2 hours and shoot for a dryback, like say 20 to 30%, and watch our ECs during that time, and then watch the plants as well. Is that a good starting point?
That is a good starting point, yeah. And one of the things I did forget to mention when I was talking about before we crop steering is also making sure that our substrate size is appropriate.
Yes. Okay. We did talk about this before. This just does not get enough play. is, and I think I showed you like an outdoor thing where they have, they're growing in like 20-gallon pots or something like that. Are you going to get a dryback in a 20-gallon pot? No, not really. So, what and Coco and rockwool do behave differently. We see Coco typically as being more forgiving. We see rockwool as being more responsive. Is that so between those two substrates, how how would you look at size if you're growing in Coco, for example? I mean, what might be a reasonable size of a volume of substrate to be able to achieve a dryback in 22 hours?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite is at 1.5 to 2 gallons of substrate per plant. That's going to give you enough capacity, enough reservoir in there to steer generatively without running into really low water contents. That matrix potential curve is a little bit different for Coco, so we can't get quite as dry before that plant might feel some actual irrigation deficit stress.
Right, some water stress as opposed to osmotic stress.
Exactly, and the goal is not necessarily to actually stress the plant. We just want to make it think that it needs to change its physiology. I heard Bruce Bugby, our friend at Apogee in Utah State. He once told me, plants are like humans. They operate best under a little bit of stress. It's like, well, you're ambitious, you want to achieve, you got a little bit of stress. That's how plants do as well. Too much stress and they break down just like us. That's exactly right. Yeah. And so, when we think about crop steering, let's say we're growing some really big plants and we've got maybe a 6x6x4 rockwool cube for our substrate. We're gonna really struggle to steer that thing generatively because the plant transpiration rates are gonna exceed the capacity of that block, and the thing's gonna run into 10%, maybe lower if it's a really happy plant. And there's if the plant is happy, it's going to pull a lot of water. It's transpiring a lot, and you're going to run out of your reservoir, out of water, out of fertigated solution in that substrate. So, obviously having that volume appropriate for the size of plants that you're growing is what's going to allow you to steer one way or the other. So if you're running in a 6x6x4, for example, you might have to always be with a 10, maybe even a 12-hour irrigation schedule just to keep those plants out of the danger zone of low water content. Yeah,
no, that's really well said. And I've seen people with tiny substrates, and it used to be kind of popular a few years ago to be like in a 6x6x4 for each plant. It's more common for the places I go to see too much substrate. That people are using like 3 gallons of Coco or something like that, and you're really not going to get much enough dryback. A shout out here to Gonzalo at Grizzly Peak. We went to meet with him. I was really impressed by the work he is doing there, and he actually took some of the data traces that people had posted on social media that he thought was doing a good job of crop steering, and he put that picture on his wall, and he said, well, I want to make my drybacks look like this. And he figured out that the way to do that was to use a smaller substrate than he was in 2 gallons of Coco, and he just decided to do less. And it's going to be different for everybody in your facility and the way that it's run, and the irrigation system that you have, particularly. I mean, some people struggle with getting drybacks because they don't have a precision irrigation system, and they're doing ebb and flow, or other irrigation approaches that aren't just netafim emitters in each plant. But I was just really impressed that he, just through looking at the data traces and the pictures of how somebody was doing a dryback, he figured out I need less substrate.
Very cool.
That's very cool. And for anyone who's on the call today, we love to hear from we love to hear success stories. We love to hear what's working and what isn't. Actually, Billy just posted a comment here, a question, and sorry, just lost it here. Billy wants to know, are there any targets for nighttime dryback in vegetative phase?
Sure. And I'm just going to jump in here and take a look at our cultivation resources so that I stay consistent with exactly what we have published. And then I sorry to sidetrack, but there was one thing that was hitting my mind while you were talking there, Scott. And it's also very important to have really healthy plants coming out of veg.
Yeah.
So, a lot of this conversation right now has been about the flower period. It is critical to have fast growing plants during veg. That veg, obviously being 18:6 light cycle, you need to start getting a lot of light to those plants, and then make sure you match your DLI going into flowers so that they get the same amount of energy, even though it's a shorter window.
Yeah. Well, and actually, after Billy's question here, I want to, you talked about that difference 1 week to 5 weeks or whatever. I want to talk a little bit about plant height and that as well. So let's do that after we get to your resource here.
Yeah, Billy. So during vegetative, we'll typically talk about drybacks for rockwool, and this is assuming the appropriate sized media, because obviously your media size is going to change how much volume this percentage equals, right? So a dryback percentage in volume is going to be that percentage times the volume of the substrate. So if I'm in a 1 gallon and I have a dryback of 10%, we're going to see 0.1 gallons of water that has evaporated and transpirated from that substrate. So for vegetative steering, typically in something like rockwool, we'll talk about 10-15%. If you've got a really large plant, sometimes it'll be a little bit more, and that's assuming that appropriately sized substrate. In cocoa, anywhere from 5 to 15% would be a more typical vegetative dryback. And these aren't exact numbers. There's just something to work off of. So there's a lot of variables that can play in here.
I just wanted to share a comment from Eddie. Eddie posted here, I found with my veg timeline of 12 to 14 days that 3.5 to 5 liters of substrate is best to achieve 20% plus drybacks for generative signals. Eddie, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. If anyone else out there has any thoughts as well for what's working for them, we'd love to hear it. Please post it in the chat.
And Eddie, is that rockwool then?
That's across rockwool and cocoa.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because I've seen people in the industry that are finding like 2 gallons is a little bit too much, which would be roughly 8 liters. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, when I'm running those veg timelines of 2 weeks, typically won't see a 20% dryback until the plant's in like 5-6 weeks of flower, and usually during that time, depending upon the cultivar, I'll want to be having a vegetative dryback for bulking.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. That's really useful.
Great. I have another question here from one of our fans on Instagram. They want to know, how much should my media dry out in between waterings?
Oh, that's a great question. And I would put a lot less emphasis on those intermediate dry downs than I would the total amount of dryback from last irrigation to first irrigation. And a little bit can happen here. So depending on your irrigation scheduling capacity, maybe if you're working with a lower grade controller, you may not be able to irrigate as many times as you'd want to during that P2. But with an appropriate size substrate between irrigations, during vegetative, we talk about maybe 2 to 5% between irrigations, and for generative, up to 5%. But when you are running generative, typically that's just P1 irrigations. So your goal is to just get to field capacity reasonably quickly, and so you may not see those dry downs in between your irrigations for generative. But for vegetative P2, when you're running those maintenance irrigations, maybe 6, maybe 12 irrigations after you've got to capacity, then 2 to 5% is probably a good reasonable range.
Yeah, and another and before I forget, we're talking about the plant height thing. So it for those plants that are in that early phase, and you talked about doing control as well. So that's what piqued my interest. If you're doing a control, is it a good idea to do a really good job of using AROYA to note the plant height and the internodal spacing of your control group, so that you can compare it once you start trying to crop steer your cultivar more aggressively?
Absolutely, and exactly like you said, the next steps after you have implemented some types of crop steering is to begin refining what your recipes look like, so you can get that repeatability and continuous improvement based on the observations you're taking. When it comes to plant height, I absolutely encourage it. And this is
how often, Jason?
How often do you have a chance to go in there and do it? Every 2 or 3 days during.
Okay, yeah. So which you could just load that up as a task in the recipe, for example. It's just taking a plant height.
Yeah, yeah, and the real critical time there is when we're looking at that first generative stacking phase. Okay. So a little bit before that, and a little bit after that, we want crop registration information like plant height. And what's going to happen is effective generative steering is going to reduce the stretching of that plant, and it's also going to give you an idea of what time frame, what plant height that you are going to expect to change steering strategies in the future.
Okay. So internodal, let's see, node spacing is how it's done here. I don't know what's typical node spacing.
1.5 inches, 2 inches.
Yeah, 1.5 here on node spacing. So I was just showing people how you can go in and very easily note these things. Probably the hardest thing is just remembering to do it and making sure that your grow techs actually take the time to put it into the notes. But then once it is in the notes, and I can go here, let's hope this actually works. Actually, this is the wrong one. So we'll go to here. I go into my groups, my harvest groups. Here's my first batch. I will actually say I harvested my plants the other day. It was awesome. But let's see, analytics. So if I go down here, and I didn't take nearly enough plant heights, but I did take a few, and you can see that they're noted here in the analytics of the harvest group. And the slowdown in the increase in plant height. So once those plants start leveling off, what's that? Why is that significant?
It's usually a great time to consider going to more vegetative bulking type of strategy.
Yeah.
So really what we've done there is curbed some of the stretching. That's indicating that that plant has got enough infrastructure from earlier on that we can switch back. That bulk or that stacking phase, is really setting the stage for the amount, the quantity, and the quality of those plants going in. So once that real vertical shooting has stopped, we can start thinking about doing some more vegetative steering.
Yep. Well, and one other thing I wanted to say, and you mentioned this earlier, is like you go in, you look at your drybacks on a particular day, and you decide, I want to actually to achieve a little bit more dryback, and then you adjust your controls, and that typically involves then going to a different system, whatever your irrigation system is, and changing those settings, either the number or the spacing or the size of the shots that are being given to the plants. And I do think this is a critical point, which is that that the system that's doing the controls, controls are about telling you what happened or what is going to happen. Controls isn't about telling you what should happen, and that's what your role as a grower is is to figure that out, to use the data and analytics to say, this is what should be happening. Here are the changes I need to make to my controls in order to achieve that. So let's say you were in that situation as a grower and you wanted to tweak to achieve a little bit more dryback. What do you do? How would you achieve that?
You either, you'd probably shorten up your irrigation window.
Mm-hmm.
So you could either decrease the time between shots, or you could just, drop off a shot, 2, 3, depending on how you want to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think typically, and we, in our quick start guide, we talk about, as opposed to vegetatively, the shot size, we recommend using a bigger shot size during that small window. We're trying to get all the watering up done and get to field capacity and then stop. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we saw, say, 25% dryback overnight, that dryback that we talk about, maybe it was 22 hours and we saw a 25% decrease. If we're trying to get that 25% replenished within an hour, maybe we've got 5% shots.
Yep. Well, and so that's my only point about controls, is that controls doesn't necessarily equal control. The things that that system is doing is helping you to execute, because it makes it possible to do all these waterings automatically without having to go do them manually, and that's great. But each day the plants are growing. Each day the environment is changing. Maybe your crew goes through and does all the plant pruning, and that changes how the plants are gonna act, because they don't have as much surface area as they used to. So that's the challenge as a grower, is to use the control system, whatever that is, and use the analytics that we're providing through the production platform to be able to do that really difficult job of just nailing it when it comes to each batch that you're growing.
That's why annotations are so very important in here, because it starts to characterize, you get that metadata into the dynamics of the room. If we've got some de-leaf parameters in there and we see that our humidity in the room has dropped because we don't have quite as much, then it's a good time to keep in mind for next round. Maybe we need to also have a little bit of an HVAC check or an HVAC modification as well as those other tasks. That
so your VPD doesn't go up.
Yep.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Hey, Scott and Jason, the last couple of minutes here, Billy wants to know if we can touch on generative dryback and ripening.
Sure. So, ripening is probably one of the more controversial phases in here. I have clients that are pretty successful employing significant generative during that ripening, and some people that don't necessarily push it quite as much. And so as far as drybacks go for ripening, you're going to be looking at a similar to that stacking phase. A lot of times we'll see a little bit of a decrease in nutrient concentration during that time frame, but you got to be a little bit careful with that. And that final ripening is going to be extremely genetic dependent. So some types of plants, we had a pineapple that they really like to foxtail. We get lots of white hairs out towards the end, and ripening will help combat any of that. Get you a nice amber trichome, get your plant to bulk out as much as possible before it's time to cut.
Yeah, and the swings that you'll see on your graphs in AROYA will be huge during that phase, as opposed to the early flower when you're not, the plants aren't even really that big. So you'll see more. What I've seen is higher differentials in EC when you're running generative in that ripening phase. Is that right?
Yep, more dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think we're at about the end of this week's office hours. Thank you all so much for attending and for submitting your questions. We do this every week. This is your time. Any questions you have about AROYA, how it can be used to improve your cultivation process, any topics you'd like us to cover in the future office hours, please let us know in the chat or shoot us an email at support.aroya@metergroup.com, or feel free to DM us on Instagram because we really want to hear from you. Just to let you all know, we record every session. We're going to email everyone in attendance a link to the video from today's discussion. It's also going to live on the AROYA YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe while you're there. And if you find these conversations helpful, feel free to share the video with anyone else who may find this information useful. Thank you all again so much for coming. Thank you, Scott and Jason, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thanks, Keisha.